I still remember the sound of laughter echoing through the marble hole that night. Not the warm kind, but the sharp, cutting kind that slices straight through your skin. My father's company had just signed their biggest deal of the year, and every investor, business partner, and family friend was here to celebrate him. That was always the story. His success, his image, his pride. I wasn't even supposed to come. Mom insisted I should. Said it would look bad if the only daughter didn't show up to her father's big event. So I put on the same black dress I'd worn to 3 of his other company parties, the one he once called to plain to be noticed. He was right. Nobody noticed. Crystal chandeliers hung above the ballroom, men in tailored suits, women in designer gowns, all floating round with champagne and fake smiles. And in the middle of it all, my father, Daniel Cole, the man who built an empire out of nothing and still managed to make me feel like nothing. When he saw me walk in, he smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He waved me over, and my heart did that stupid hopeful thing again, thinking maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. Here she is, he said, clapping his hands once to grab everyone's attention. The crowd turned. Dozens of faces looked at me. Waiting, this is my daughter, he announced proudly, then paused just long enough to twist the knife. The creative one who decided the business world wasn't for her. People chuckled softly. I tried to smile, but my lips felt like glass. He went on. She said she wanted to follow her dreams. His voice even mimicked mine. I told her, dreams don't pay bills. But hey, he raised his glass. We still love her for trying. Laughter, polite, uncomfortable laughter. I could feel my cheeks burn. Mom looked away, pretending to sip her drink. My brother smirked behind his glass. The golden child, standing exactly where I used to dream of being. I excused myself quietly, walked past the catering tables and out onto the balcony. The night air was cold, heavy with music and muffled laughter. I leaned against the railing, blinking fast to keep the tears from falling. I hated that I still cared, that after all these years of being belittled, ignored, I still craved one word of approval from the man who taught me how to doubt myself. From inside, I could hear his voice again. He was telling the story of how he built his empire. And in the middle of it, I heard him say the sentence that would burn itself into my memory forever. She'll never be anyone important. She doesn't have what it takes. The words weren't loud, but they echoed in me louder than anything else that night. I gripped the railing until my knuckles turned white. The city lights blurred behind my tears. That was the moment something inside me broke, and something else woke up. No yelling, no confrontation, just silence. The kind of silence that comes right before a storm. I wiped my face, straightened my shoulders, and whispered to myself, okay, Dad, let's see who's right. Then I walked back inside, smiling, not because I was fine, but because he'd just given me the reason I needed to become unstoppable. When I got home from that party, I didn't sleep. The laughter still echoed in my ears. It wasn't the first time he had humiliated me, but it was the first time I decided to remember every word, not to cry over it, to use it. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, and the memories came back one after another. Snapshots of a childhood built around his approval I never earned. The perfect Sami brother. Evan could do no wrong. Straight A's, varsity captain, business school prodigy, Dad's clone. Every dinner conversation began and ended with him. When Evan walked in, Dad's eyes lit up. When I did, he checked his watch. I was the kid who brought home trophies that didn't matter. Art contests, writing awards, debate ribbons, he called them hobbies. I remember showing him my first painting at 11. He looked at it, sighed, and said, pretty colors, honey, but what's the use? Then he hung Evan's basketball medal right over it. That's how I learned silence. Mom's smile. Mom never fought him. She lived in a world of polite smiles and soft excuses. Your father just wants the best for you, she'd whisper, as if love had to sound like judgment to be real. She'd slide an extra cookie onto my plate afterward, her quiet way of saying sorry. I loved her for it, but I also resented how small she made herself to keep the peace. I swore I wouldn't do the same. Maybe that was my first act of rebellion. Grandma June was the only one who saw me. She'd sit me on the porch swing and tell me, "Sweetheart, there's more than one kind of smart." She smelled of lavender and old books. She taught me that empathy was strength, not weakness. When Dad told me art was a waste of time, Grandma slipped me a sketch pad and said, "Then waste a little time every day." The day she died, something in me dimmed. At her funeral, Dad gave a perfect speech about family unity. I couldn't look at him. Grandma had been my only proof that love could be gentle. The decision be 22. I tried everything to make him proud. Joined his company as an intern, worked late, spoke less, dressed like his assistants. Still, he found something to fix. "You're too emotional. Learn to be tougher. You'll thank me when you grow up." One night, after another meeting where he corrected every word I said, I stayed behind in the empty conference room. The city glowed through the glass wall, cold, unreachable. I saw my reflection in it. Tired eyes, tight smell, a ghost of a woman trying to fit into a suit that never belonged to her. That's when I decided I was done trying, done begging for a seat at his table. I'd build my own. I packed my desk the next morning. He didn't even look up when I said I was leaving. Just muttered, "You'll crawl back when the world shows you how hard it is." Maybe he was right. The world was hard, but I was harder. The first night out, my apartment was small. Walls thin enough to hear strangers argue through them. I ate instant noodles and stared at the blank wall where a future should be. But for the first time in years, the silence felt mine. No footsteps pacing behind me. No disappointed sighs. No expectations. Just space. And the faint smell of freedom. I didn't know it yet. But that night was the start of everything. The beginning of the version of me my father could never imagine. The one he would someday call Madam. The first winter after I left home felt longer than any I'd lived through. The radiator in my tiny studio clanked like it was dying, and sometimes I thought it was cheering me on one last gasp at survival. I worked at a coffee shop by day and filed spreadsheets for a small startup at night. 2 jobs, 1 dream, to never need my father again. Rent, food, bills, numbers that never balanced. Still, I refused to call home. Every morning I'd wake before sunrise, pull my worn coat tighter, and remind myself, this is mine. The struggle, the exhaustion, the freedom all mine. The days that blurred together for months, life became a loop. Caffeine, commutes, cheap meals, and the endless hum of other people's success on social media. My father's company made headlines every week. Call Industries expands again. Daniel Cole wins Businessman of the Year. I'd scroll past those articles quickly, pretending my chest didn't tighten. One night, after closing, I caught my reflection in the cafe window. Flour-stained apron, dark circles under my eyes. The same hands that once painted, now scrubbing coffee stains from countertops. I laughed quietly. It was either that or cry. The letter a month later. A letter arrived, no return address. Just my name written in a handwriting I knew by heart. Grandma June's daughter had been sealed and held by her lawyer since the day she died. Inside was a single line written on her floral stationery. "When the world tells you you're too small, build something so big they can't ignore you." I sat on the floor and read that sentence until the paper grew soft in my hands. I taped it above my desk, next to a list of design sketches I'd been too scared to finish. That night, for the first time in months, I opened my laptop not to job hunt, but to create. The failer's first product launch flopped. So did the second. A local boutique agreed to stock my designs, then closed 2 weeks later. Every failure felt like my father whispering, "I told you so." But every time I wanted to quit, I'd hear Grandma's voice instead. "Build something big." So I kept building. Sleep became optional. I learned, adapted, improved. And somehow, the rejection started sounding less like endings and more like directions. The breaking point thing came the night that almost broke me. I'd just gotten off a 12-hour shift at the cafe. Rain poured sideways, soaking through my shoes. When I reached my apartment door, An eviction notice flapped in the wind and paid rent. 3 days to vacate. I stood there, shaking, half from cold, half from the weight of every choice I'd made. For the first time, I considered calling my father, not for help, just to say, "You were right." I dialed his number, listened to it ring, and then hung up. He didn't deserve to hear me weak. Not this time. I slid down the hallway wall, closed my eyes, and whispered to myself, "If I survive this night, I'll never beg again." The morning after at sunrise, I sold my last piece of jewelry, grandma's locket, and used the money to pay the deposit for a shared workspace. No bed, no comfort, but a desk, a place to start again. That was the day I learned rock bottom isn't where you end, it's where you stop falling. The co-working space smelled like burnt coffee and fresh ambition. Rows of second-hand desks, flickering fluorescent lights, and people chasing impossible dreams. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. No one there knew I was Daniel Cole's failure of a daughter. Here, I was just another woman trying to build something out of scraps. Every morning, I'd unlock my corner cubicle, open my battered laptop, and stare at a blank screen until the fear passed. Then I'd start sketching logos, packaging ideas, color palettes, anything that made me feel alive again. My fingers moved like they remembered what joy felt like. A stranger's compliment afternoon. An older woman named Margaret Hale stopped by my desk. She ran a small handmade soap brand across the aisle. She peered over my shoulder and said, "You have an eye for detail. Ever thought of designing for others?" That one sentence lit something inside me. By evening, I drafted her a free logo concept. 2 days later, she paid me $150. I hadn't expected. It wasn't much, but it felt heavier than any paycheck I'd ever gotten. It was proof. Little win soon. Word spread inside the workspace. A candle business, a bakery, a yoga instructor. They all came to me for designs. It wasn't glamorous. It was hustle. But for the first time, people valued what I created instead of laughing at it. At night, I'd still scrub tables at the cafe. But now the exhaustion felt different, turned, not inflicted. Every tip went into a glass jar labeled Freedom Fund. It grew slowly, like trust rebuilt after heartbreak. The mentor Margaret became my quiet mentor. She'd drop by with tea and stories of her early failures. Once, she said, "You know, success isn't about being louder. It's about lasting longer." Those words angered me through every setback. When I doubted myself, she'd glance at me and add, "Your father raised a fighter. He just doesn't know it yet." I never told her who my father was. Maybe someday I would. For now, it was enough that someone finally saw me as capable. The turning point: 6 months later, my freelance work paid enough to quit the cafe. I handed in my apron, walked home in the evening sun, and for the first time in years, breathed without guilt. I stood before my cracked bathroom mirror and whispered, "You did this. Not we. Not him. You." The next morning, I registered my company, June Design Studio, named after Grandma. A promise finally kept. The message at weeks later. A message popped up on my phone. "Is this Anna Cole? My firm needs a full rebrand. Cole Enterprises LLC." My hands froze. Different Cole, different world. But still, the name burned. I smelled. It was a sign, the universe's way of saying, keep building. The circle will close when it's time. Success doesn't arrive with a knock. It sneaks in while you're too busy surviving to notice. One morning, I opened my laptop to find 10 new emails, all from small businesses wanting my help with branding. By nightfall, that number doubled. Margaret's soap line had gone viral after a magazine feature, and she'd credited June Design Studio for the visuals. Overnight, my name was suddenly in demand. The growth next month felt like living inside a storm. A good one this time. Meetings, invoices, endless deadlines. I hired my first assistant, a bright college girl named Kayla, and rented a small 2-room office downtown. The first thing I hung on the wall was Grandma's letter. When the world tells you you're too small, build something so big they can't ignore you. Every time I looked at it, my chest tightened, not from sadness anymore, but from pride. I was doing it. without my father's name, without his money, without his approval. The new identity as my clients grew, so did my confidence. For the first time, people called me Madam Cole, and it didn't sting anymore. I'd earned that title on my own. But I never bragged, never posted online about my father. Revenge, I decided, didn't have to be loud. It could be quiet, elegant. I wanted him to discover me the same way everyone else would, by needing me. And soon, fate gave me that chance. The Conferencione autumn afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a design summit in Chicago. The theme, the future of family brands. I left when I read it. Family, the one word that had haunted me since childhood. Still, I went. It was a chance to show what I'd built. As I stood backstage, adjusting my blazer, a voice called my name, deep, commanding, familiar. My breath caught. I turned. My father stood there, gray hair, sharp suit, the same cold eyes. Anna, he said slowly, as if he couldn't believe it. I didn't realize you were still in this field, this industry. I smiled. Yes, Dad, still surviving. He gave that same half smile he always did before cutting someone down. Well, don't embarrass yourself out there. There are serious investors attending. I nodded politely. But inside, something solidified. This was the moment I'd been unknowingly building toward. The stage. When my turn came, I stepped on stage. Under the bright white lights, dozens of faces stared back. Business owners, CEOs, investors, and in the front row, my father, arms crossed, watching. I began my talk not with data or strategy, but with a story. When I was younger, someone told me I'd never be anyone important. They said dreams were foolish and failure was my destiny. I believed them until the day I stopped asking for permission to exist. The room went still. I could feel my father's glare pierce through me, but I didn't look his way. I spoke for 20 minutes about resilience, creativity, and rebuilding yourself from nothing. When I finished, the crowd stood up in applause. Every person except one. My father stayed seated, but that didn't matter because for the first time, I didn't need him to stand. The call that night, my inbox exploded with partnership offers, and among them was one that made my hands tremble. Dear Ms. Cole, we're expanding our brand image and would love June Design Studio to lead the project. Daniel Cole, CEO, Cole Industries. I read it 3 times. No hi, sweetheart. No dad. Just CEO to CEO. I laughed softly. The irony was perfect. He'd finally found me. But only because his empire now needed the daughter he once called a failure. I didn't say yes immediately. I let his email sit in my inbox for 3 days. Unopened, but visible, like a trophy. It was proof that I didn't need to chase validation anymore. It had finally come to me. On the 4th day, I replied with a single line. I'd be happy to discuss terms. Let's schedule a meeting. No hello, Dad, no emotion, just business. The Aravoltwo. Weeks later, I walked into Cole Industries headquarters for the first time in 5 years. The same glass doors that once opened for me as a child with a sense of pride now swung open for a woman who'd built her own empire. The receptionist looked up, startled. Welcome, Miss Cole, she said, eyes widening as if she recognized the name. I'll let Mr. Cole know you've arrived. The marble floors still gleamed. The smell of money, power, and cold ambition hung in the air. I used to feel small here. Now, I just felt steady. The meeting boardroom was as I remembered, massive, intimidating, and perfectly sterile. My father stood near the window, phone in hand, pretending not to notice me. Anna, he said finally, turning. You look different, successful, I offered with a polite smile. He ignored that. I didn't realize your company had grown this much. Our PR department says your work is impressive. Thank you, I said, keeping my voice even. It took years. No shortcuts, he gave a short, dry chuckle. Well, you always were stubborn. I sat down, sliding my portfolio across the table. Let's talk about your rebranding campaign. You said you wanted something timeless. The switch in tone threw him off. He'd expected sentiment. He got strategy. The power shift as I spoke. I watched his expression change. The man who once dismissed me now struggled to keep up with my ideas. Every design mock-up, every proposal I presented, was polished, powerful, and 10 steps ahead of what his team could have imagined. Finally, he cleared his throat. "This is impressive work, Anna, but we'll need you to adjust your pricing. Call Industries has its own standards." I smiled. "Of course, but I don't offer family discounts. You'll pay what every client pays, in full, upfront." The silence that followed was delicious. He stared, processing the fact that his daughter was now the one setting boundaries. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Fine, send over the contract." The office whispers. I walked out. One of his employees, a woman in her 40s, caught up to me in the hallway. She leaned in and whispered, "I've worked here 15 years. I've never seen him look that small." I smiled faintly. Neither have I. The first win that night, I celebrated alone. Just a glass of wine, quiet music, and the soft hum of the city. Not out of pride, but peace. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. Finally standing in the same room as him and realizing I didn't need to prove anything. Still, deep down, a small part of me wanted more. Not to hurt him, but to make him see, to make him understand what he'd thrown away. The next morning, his assistant called. "Ms. Cole," she said, "Mr. Cole wants to know if you'd be interested in overseeing the full merger campaign next quarter." He said, and I quote, "No one else gets it like she does." I hung up the phone slowly, a smirk forming despite myself. It had begun. The same man who once called me a failure was now trusting me to save his company's image. And he didn't even realize the story he thought he was writing had become mine. I walked into the grand ballroom like a shadow that had learned to move in the light. Chandeliers hung like frozen stars, and soft music curled around the laughter of people who thought they knew me. But tonight, I wasn't the girl who had slunk out to the balcony years ago, hiding tears behind a glass of wine. Tonight, I was the reason some of those people had arrived. My heels clicked against the marble floor, a quiet metronome, announcing my presence without shouting. Familiar faces glanced my way, curiosity flickering across their features. Some hesitated, trying to place me, and then there he was. My father, Daniel Cole, the man whose opinion had once been the gravity of my life. He was standing near the center of the room, glass in hand, telling the story of his empire to a cluster of investors. His words were polished, practiced, confident, but the moment my eyes met his, I saw it, a flicker of doubt, recognition, something that hadn't existed there before. The host stepped forward, raising a glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur. "Tonight we have the honor of welcoming our newest investor, someone who has already transformed the way we think about business." I let a breath escape, slow and deliberate. I didn't hurry. I didn't need to. Every eye in the room would find me in its own time. He turned toward me mid-sentence, scanning the room. When his gaze landed, it froze. I could see it, the realization creeping in, slow and sharp, that the little girl he once dismissed had become the woman everyone had been waiting for. I walked forward, one measured step after another, heels tapping like quiet thunder. The laughter that had haunted me years ago was gone. Now, the silence followed me, thick and full of tension. When I reached the center, the host extended his hand. "I believe she needs no introduction," he said, and I smiled. Small, controlled, unshakable. "I'm Anna Cole," I said, letting the name settle in the room. No hesitation, no explanation, just presence. The hush was instantaneous. People turned to look. Phones flickered with subtle flashes. And my father, he stared. Recognition hit him fully. And for a second, the man who had always seemed untouchable looked small. I saw pride, disbelief, and shame swirl across his face all at once. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. I didn't give him the satisfaction of an explanation. I didn't need to. He had already seen. He had already understood. I let my eyes sweep across the room, feeling the quiet power of my own arrival. No one laughed. No one whispered about the failure they thought I was. All that mattered was the shift. invisible to anyone who hadn't watched me grow. I had returned, not for revenge, not for approval. I had returned because I was ready to stand in my own light. And as I raised my glass just slightly, in a gesture of calm control, I whispered to myself, "Watch closely, Dad, this is only the beginning." The night stretched ahead, glittering and charged, and I knew it. Years of quiet determination, of struggle in tiny apartments, of sleepless nights, of failures and small victories had led to this exact moment. He had once told me I would never be anyone important. Now, I was the one who held the power. Quietly, elegantly, completely, the ballroom had quieted down, the music fading to a low hum, and people drifted away into clusters of conversation. I didn't need an audience for this part. This moment was for him and me alone. I found him near the grand staircase, glass forgotten in his hand, staring at the crowd as if it could explain what had just happened. "Anna," he said, voice low, uncertain. I let the pause linger. He wanted an apology, recognition, something to restore his sense of control. I leaned against the railing beside him, careful to keep my tone calm, deliberate. "You look different," he said, as if noticing me for the first time in decades. I smiled faintly, almost tenderly. "I've been busy," I said, not bragging, not threatening, just stating a fact. He ran a hand through his gray-streaked hair, his shoulders tense. "You know, I was hard on you for your own good," he said finally. The words were rehearsed, familiar, hollow. I looked at him directly, soft eyes, steady. "You taught me exactly how to survive without you," I said quietly. No accusation, no anger, just truth. He blinked. The silence hung between us, heavier than any shouting match we'd ever had. You did all this on your own?" he asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. "Yes," I said, "without your guidance, without your approval, without your help." He swallowed hard. I could see the conflict in his face, pride and shame tangled together in a way that made him look smaller than I had ever seen him. "You're remarkable," he said finally, almost a whisper. I shook my head slightly. "Remarkable is just a word. Dad, you had your chance to see it in me years ago. Now, it's too late to understand it the way you wanted to." He flinched, but I didn't stop. I wanted him to feel the truth without me having to punish him. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said. "I'm here to show you what's possible when someone stops waiting for permission. You've always said I'd fail. I didn't fail. I succeeded quietly, on my own terms." His eyes softened slightly, a flicker of emotion breaking through the rigid lines of his face. "And the company?" he asked, voice small. "You'll stay involved," I said, my tone even, firm but fair. "Under my company, you'll have a position, one where you contribute. But the decisions, the direction, that's mine now." He looked at me, swallowed, and nodded slowly. "I understand," he said finally. We stood there for a long moment, neither moving, neither speaking. I could feel the years of tension, of dismissal, of silence between us. I let it settle, not with anger, not with triumph, but with grace. "You raised me to fight," I said softly, almost to myself. "And now, I've learned to do it my way." He nodded again. This time, it was quieter, deeper, in acknowledgement of the woman I had become. Not the girl he tried to control, not the daughter he underestimated. The woman who had quietly, elegantly, claimed everything he once said I couldn't have. And in that moment, I realized something important. Revenge doesn't always need rage. Sometimes it's just being better, being strong, being everything they said you would never be. I offered him a hand, calm, steady. He took it hesitantly, almost reverently. It was a handshake, yes, but also a transfer of understanding, of acknowledgement, of a battle fought and won without raising a voice. I didn't look for praise. I didn't want celebration. I only wanted him to see me not as a failure, not as a disappointment, but as someone who had always been unstoppable, even when no one believed in her. And in that quiet, fleeting moment, I felt peace. The weeks that followed the gala were quieter than I expected. No fanfare, no whispers in the hallways, just the steady pulse of work, of decisions made, of a world that now recognized me not as my father's daughter, but as Nicole, a force in her own right. My father resigned quietly from his company a few days later, not with anger, not with drama, just a letter on my desk. His signature at the bottom, acknowledging that the era had shifted. It felt surreal. The man who had once made me feel invisible now moved aside without resistance. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. The victory wasn't about him anymore. It was about me, about closure, about finally being free of the weight of his approval. Mom called one afternoon. Her voice was shaky, quiet, unlike the composed woman I had grown up with. "Anna, I'm sorry," she said. For the first time, I heard the words without judgment, without excuse. I didn't scold. I didn't lecture. I just said, "Thank you for saying that." Later, I visited Grandma June's grave. The cemetery smelled of damp earth and old flowers, the air heavy with the quiet of memory. I knelt, fingers brushing the cold stone. "You were right, Grandma," I whispered. "I made it, not for him, not for anyone else, for me, for the girl who learned to fight quietly, to build, to survive, to rise." I left her a small bouquet of lavender, her favorite, the scent sharp and sweet against the autumn air. For the first time in my life, I felt whole. The hollow ache of needing approval, of being overlooked, of being humiliated, it had faded. Even my father respected the distance now. He didn't try to control me. He didn't lecture. He simply watched, quietly, as I led my company, made decisions, and guided a team of people who believed in me because of what I built, not because of the name behind me. And somewhere deep inside, I understood that revenge had never been about causing him pain. It was about becoming everything he said I couldn't be. It was about walking into the many room man knowing that my worth, my power, my identity didn't require his recognition anymore. I smiled softly, closing my eyes against the wind. The city stretched before me, alive and indifferent, and I felt perfectly aligned with it. I had survived. I had thrived. And finally, I had peace. Months had passed since the gala, since the conversation, since the quiet settling of power between my father and me. Life had returned to its rhythm, busy, demanding, exhilarating, but the weight of approval no longer tethered me. I attended an industry event one crisp autumn evening. The hall was buzzing with CEOs, investors, and journalists, all exchanging handshakes and carefully polished smiles. I moved through the crowd with ease, confident, unassuming, yet undeniably present. And then I heard it, my daughter. My father's voice carried across the room, clear and strong, tinged with pride this time. I turned, and there he stood, no hesitation, no smirk, just acknowledgement. "My boss, and my daughter," he said, introducing me to a group of investors who looked on in surprise. A soft heat rose in my chest, not the triumph of revenge, not the satisfaction of proving someone wrong, but the quiet joy of being recognized on my terms. No one could ever take that away. The investors shook my hand, spoke to me with respect, asked questions that mattered, and as I guided the conversation, I noticed my father standing slightly back, watching, finally understanding the woman I had always been, even before he had realized it. Later, outside, I stepped onto the terrace and felt the cool evening air brush against my face. The city lights flickered like distant promises, steady and unrelenting. I thought about every failure, every sleepless night, every whispered word of doubt that had once haunted me, and I realized revenge had never been about rage or humiliation. It had been about becoming everything they said I couldn't be. It had been about grace, resilience, and quiet power. It had been about me. I smiled to myself, soft but unwavering. Somewhere, far away, I could almost hear Grandma June's voice. "Build something so big they can't ignore you." I had done that, not for approval, not for validation, for the girl who had once watched from the balcony, humiliated and unseen, for the woman who had finally taken her place in the world without compromise, without apology, without regret. And in that moment, I understood. The circle was complete. I had returned, not as a failure, not as a disappointment, but as everything they said I would never be. And it was more beautiful than I had ever imagined.